Hey, have you heard? White South Africans are currently being oppressed. At least, that's what these people are saying. Yes, since the beginning of February, the Trump administration, Afrikaner lobby groups, Elon Musk, and all their followers have accused South Africa of discriminating and even inciting violence against white people. The latest attacks have been on this resistance anthem, which is pointed to as calling for attacks on white farmers. Little background here, the title of this historic struggle song is often translated to kill or shoot the boer, and although in Afrikaans boer means farmer, since the 19th century it has also meant Afrikaans person. But more on that later. This struggle song emerged in the 1980s as opposition to decades of apartheid rule and is still used as a chant of liberation, though granted, its lyrics are quite inflammatory. Though perhaps that's the point. So, to cut a long story short, Musk and co have been in a tizzy lately because Julius Malema, leader of a party called the Economic Freedom Fighters, has been chanting this song at his rallies. But focusing on this one chant while removing the context in which it was born has been intentional in my opinion. In fact, I'd say that all of this is a distraction. As Toni Morrison said, quote, "The function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language and so you spend 20 years proving that you do. None of that is necessary. There will always be one more thing." I mean, there are even movements headed by Western foreigners, it seems, currently pushing for independence from the rest of the country. Oh yes, folks, it seems things have gotten bad. Really bad.
In South Africa, if you're white, you have a target on your back, whether you live on a farm or whether you live in the suburbs.
But let's quickly look at the facts. There has never been anything that's even come close to an attempted of white South Africans. So why does it seem like Trump, Elon, and co can't keep South Africa out of their mouths? Well, one could say it's because South Africa practically embodies everything they're trying to destroy, so it's effectively become a useful tool in their culture wars, and one thing they've really zeroed in on is the Expropriation Act of 2025. See, these angry men claim that South Africa's new Land Expropriation Act forcibly seizes private land from white citizens without compensation. Or, in President Trump's own words, South Africa is confiscating land and treating certain classes of people very badly. Yeah, my Trump impersonation's not the best, but you know, let's move past it. The class Trump is referring to is that of Afrikaners, a community of white people descended from predominantly Dutch settlers. I'm not gonna get into how they arrived in South Africa, but I think you can guess. So because this community is currently facing persecution and, in Musk's words this time, white genocide, the United States has offered to rehouse them as refugees. Here's the thing though, and it really bears repeating. Since the end of apartheid, no laws have ever involved the forced seizure of white-owned land. In fact, despite being a minority, white South Africans own about 70% of South Africa's private farmland. The US is effectively giving refugee status to one of the most economically privileged groups in South Africa. Not to mention that all these talks of white oppression really ring hollow when you consider the fact that there still exist white-only towns. Yes, you heard right, white only in Africa. This creator made a video all about it if you want to check it out. But I digress. See, apartheid or apartness in Afrikaans was a system of legislation that upheld segregation against non-white South Africans for over 40 years, and this included the confiscation, forced removal, and redistribution of land. For example, the Native Land Act of 1913, passed 3 years after South Africa gained its independence, limited black land ownership to just 7% of the entire land, forcing many to leave their home and move into reserves.
The Native Lands Act of 1913 pushed black people into these areas and restricted them from owning land everywhere else.
South Africa sure was independent, but that independence only extended to white citizens, particularly white men. Then, in 1923, the South African government passed another act that stripped black residents of ownership rights, and after that, a series of land acts set aside more than 80% of the country's land for the white minority, eventually forcing non-whites to carry permits if and when they had to travel within restricted white-only areas.
Over the following centuries, black Africans were segregated onto so-called native reserves. And by the 20th century, that meant 70% of the population was living on roughly 13% of the country's land.
And those centuries of land inequality can still be felt today, where despite making up 81% of South Africa's population, black people only own 4% of private land. So really, all the Expropriation Act aims to do is right some of those wrongs by making it easier for the state to expropriate land in the public interest. I mean, if you really want to talk about land theft, look no further than Sophiatown, a black cultural hub that was ripped apart and rebuilt as a whites-only area. See, in 1955, Sophiatown was one of the last areas in Johannesburg and South Africa as a whole where black people could own land. A man named Herman Tabayansky had purchased the land in 1897, but when the city of Johannesburg decided to build a sewage plant nearby and all the wealthy white people moved out, he was forced to sell it for cheap to black residents. Through time, Sophiatown became a safe haven for non-whites, which in turn led to an explosion of music, dance, and culture. Artistic greats like Miriam Makeba got their start in Sophiatown, and its cultural vibrancy even earned it the nickname of Little Harlem.
It was called Little Harlem. We had jazz, we had gangsters, you had dancing clubs where people would dance against each other.
And right alongside its jazzy clubs and galleries, Sophiatown was also home to some of the loudest voices in the fight against apartheid. And that quickly became a problem for the South African parliament of the time. To give you a better idea as to why, here's an excerpt from a vertical video I made about the legacy of apartheid. After the National Party's rise in 1948, the all-white government began enforcing policies of racial segregation. You see, apartheid didn't just come out of nowhere. Oppression and racial segregation implemented by Cape settlers in the 17th century played a vital role in the legalized inequalities under apartheid. They believed that they were God's chosen people, that only they could uphold the light of Christian civilization against darkness, and consequently, that their right to South Africa's land was greater than anybody else's, including the indigenous population. Again, a rhetoric that has been and is used to justify mass displacement. So, in 1913, a land act was established which forcibly relocated black people to reserves and outlawed the ability to work as sharecroppers. And sadly, that was just the beginning of a series of legislations that sought to disenfranchise and disempower the non-white population. Non-white South Africans, a majority in their own land, were pushed to live in separate areas, use distinct public facilities, and were systematically deprived of equal rights. The government was intent on protecting the white minority and securing their economic advantages, so as you can imagine, non-whites faced a litany of human rights violations, from physical violence to economic exploitation. Not to mention that Sophiatown's multiracial composition flew right in the face of apartheid ideals.
We had all nationalities. We had Zulus, Chinese, Indians, and we lived in harmony together.
As former resident Don Matera says, Sophiatown was the antithesis of what they wanted for this country. So the government started plotting its demise. In 1950, it passed the Group Areas Act, which effectively prohibited different racial groups from living together, and used that to push the residents of Sophiatown out of the area. Although push isn't really the right word here. It was more of a brutal forced removal.
They told us, climb the truck. You just have to follow the rules, what they were saying, so that nobody in your family gets injured or killed.
Anti-apartheid activists like Nelson Mandela mobilized against the eviction, but there was little they could do. So over 8 years, more than 3 million Black South Africans were forcibly removed from their homes, and Sophiatown was bulldozed, flattened, and completely erased from the maps of Johannesburg. Well, the name was erased. In actuality, Sophiatown became Triumph. Yes, the Afrikaans word for triumph. And sadly, Sophiatown wasn't the only place apartheid triumphed. In fact, it was the first in a series of forced removals that ripped apart non-white communities throughout the 1950s and 1960s. However, in February 2006, so half a century after the evictions, the name Triumph was changed back to Sophiatown because, as the then mayor said, the name, quote, evokes memories of a vibrant, creative, multicultural community, a place where artists, writers, and musicians flourished against the odds in an atmosphere of racial intolerance. So for President Trump and Elon Musk to focus on misinformation and manufactured hate is a slap in the face to those who've actually been on the receiving end of apartheid's brutality. And it's also pretty ironic considering that, again, there still exist white-only towns in South Africa.
The spirit of apartheid is still alive in some places. One of them is Orania, a remote town in the country's north, often called the last outpost of apartheid. Why? Because Orania is a whites-only town.
So, excuse me for not buying into the whole white oppression thing. It's really obsessive fear-mongering at its finest because, let's be clear one last time, apartheid systematically destroyed Black communities, and those effects are still being heavily felt by Black South Africans today. If you're threatened by chance of resistance or even, say, I don't know, diversity, equity, or inclusion, then I'd say you're the problem. Remember, equality always feels like oppression to the privileged. And that's all for now, folks. If you like this video, don't forget to subscribe, comment, and give a big ol' thumbs up. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Bye.